Hello and welcome to Filling the Sink, a podcast from Catalan News. My name is Lea Beliaeva, and today we're talking about the tragic week of 1909. Barcelona is the city in the world with the most extensive history of barricade fights. These words are from philosopher Friedrich Engels, and many other thinkers have pointed at Barcelona as the city of revolutions. 115 years ago, on July 25th, 1909, one of the first popular uprisings of the century took shape in the Catalan capital. This became known as the Tragic Week or La Setmana Tràgica. What first started as an anti-war movement opposing the conscription to the colonial war in Morocco soon turned into an anti-clerical revolt. And it left a striking image: the Barcelona sky filled with smoke as over 80 churches were set on fire. On today's podcast, we will revisit the uprising, and we will also talk about how Barcelona became the capital of revolutionary movements and got the name Rose of Fire. I'm joined today by Oriol Escudé. Welcome back, Oriol.
Hello, Lea. It's been a while.
It's been a while. I'm really happy to have you back. We're going to talk about a super interesting topic today.
Yeah, I loved it. I had a really nice time producing it. Looking forward to it.
Well, let's get into it. So I just gave this really brief introduction to the topic, but what led up to this uprising?
Well, there are multiple factors. A lot of things were happening at the time. We're talking about the beginning of the 20th century. At the time, Catalonia had experienced a rapid industrialization, which led to poor working conditions and widespread dissatisfaction among workers. And that inequality between the rich, wealthy, industrial class and the poor workers led to the rise of anarchism, socialism, trade unions, and a general workers' movement.
And that's what we saw around Europe at the same time, and that also took place here in Barcelona.
Exactly. All those ideologies were present in the city at the time, but there was also a lot of discontent with the church because it was seen as an ally of the ruling class. And that anti-clerical sentiment was very present in Barcelona. And even though this was not a nationalist movement, a pro-independence or a Catalan nationalist movement, that sentiment was present in the city too at the time. And we'll see later how that was important in this conflict.
Okay, so that was the context or the background of the revolt, but there was specifically one thing that triggered it.
Yeah, it was the colonial war in Morocco. At the time, Spain was involved in this war in the Rif region, northern Morocco. It's a mountain range. And they needed more soldiers, basically, and they called up reservists. And most of them were from Catalonia.
And this was perceived as an attack on Catalans, right?
Yeah, because Catalonia, they were very sensitive about colonial wars. They saw how many Catalan soldiers went to the colonial wars in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and they never returned. So this had a deep mark on Catalans, and they felt that this new colonial war in Morocco was a thing of Madrid. They didn't have this sentiment of, colonialism. So they felt it was unfair.
I see. And then it was also seen as an attack on the poor.
Yeah, like always, right, with these things.
Yeah.
Because basically you could pay and you could buy exemptions and not go to war. And this privilege was only available to the wealthy families.
Of course.
And this was exacerbated by the fact that many rich families were making money out of colonialism in Catalonia. So the poor were going to war to die and get injured, and the rich were making money out of war. One of the families, for example, very well known, it will ring a bell, the Welsh were actively involved in the war in Morocco.
Oh, the Welsh.
Yeah, the Welsh were a very powerful family in Catalonia, and they invested in the iron mines in Morocco, which they were fighting for. So there was an economic interest. And also they were making money because Spain didn't have enough ships to transport the 40,000 men to Morocco. So they needed other companies to do that service. And the Welsh had investments in another naval company which was doing the transporting of the soldiers. So they were making a lot of money out of this war.
So this was very much a class revolt.
Yeah, there was this huge sense of injustice that the poor were dying and paying for the benefit of the rich.
Okay, and this led to the Setmana Tràgica, the tragic week. What exactly happened?
It all started on Monday, 26th of July, and this began with a general strike. And basically, everyone supported it. All the workers joined the strike. And there were the first protests and clashes. There was one sector that didn't strike, the tram workers.
Okay.
And then strikers tried to stop the tram from working. And this led to the first violent clashes with authorities. And from there, it just basically, Barcelona was taken over by barricades, protests. There were clashes with police, with authorities. The governor called the martial law because the thing was too big that they couldn't stop it. And then they started burning churches.
Okay, but why did they start burning churches if it was an anti-war demonstration?
Yeah, this is a great question that historians are still debating about this today. Why an anti-war movement was turned into an anti-clerical movement? Why did they burn churches and not the house of the wealthy or the companies or the industries? One of the reasons why, and the main one probably, is that it was a movement without political guidance. So no politicians, no parties, the anarchists, the socialists, the Republicans, anyone took over, anyone wanted control over the strike, the revolution. So it turned chaotic, without objectives, and they started burning churches because the church was seen as an ally of the ruling class. So
it started taking this revolutionary, uncontrolled form, but how did it end?
Well, the revolt lacked external support. No one supported it from outside Catalonia, Spanish parties, for example, or internationally. And one of the reasons why is because the Spanish government branded it a separatist revolt. So a nationalist, Catalan nationalist movement. And that's why the movement became isolated. And a few days later, with the repression, the arrival of the military forces, the movement began to collapse.
So this week, as we have mentioned, was labeled the tragic week, but it wasn't tragic for everyone. And you talked to historian and professor at Pompeu Fabra University, Josep Pich. He says that for some, it was revolutionary and even a glorious week.
Yeah, we call it tragic week basically because Joan Maragall, a Catalan poet and journalist, wrote a series of articles calling it the tragic week. But Josep proposes another name, the Revolution of 1909.
If you
look at the press at the time, the descriptions vary widely. Tragic week, bloody week, vandal week, dark week. Even from the Republican perspective, it was called the Glorious Week or the Red Week. You can also find books that refer to it as the Revolution of July 1909, the failed revolution of 1909.
Historian Josep Pich argues that the Setmana Tràgica was not just a simple anti-war and anti-clerical movement, but rather a revolution.
Ataqueu edificis religiosos, però no els mateu.
They attacked religious buildings, but they did not kill anyone. In fact, this is a major difference compared to other anti-clerical movements. There were deaths, yes, but very few and almost all at the beginning. So the anti-clerical attack, if you will, was essentially symbolic. What they did was remove the clergy and destroy the buildings, which is not what typically happens in most anti-clerical movements.
Josep defends that precisely because it was not an anti-clerical movement, they did not burn more significant religious buildings, such as the Cathedral of Barcelona. He believes that the Setmana Tràgica has much more historical significance than it is given.
El preludi més important...
It was the most significant prelude to what would become the Civil War, which began in 1936, 27 years later. In other words, what was anticipated in 1909 and remained unresolved then is what would explode in July 1936. Only this time it would not be symbolic. It would turn into actual violence.
Thanks to Josep Pich for speaking with us. So what was the aftermath of the tragic week?
So between 75 and 100 people died. 3 of them were priests and all the others were protesters. And there were many, many more injured. Around 2,000 people were arrested and thousands were sent to prison.
And many of these people were actually sent to the Barcelona prison called La Model.
Yeah.
And we did a podcast about La Model just a while back. So if you want to learn more about that, check that out.
And from these that were sent to prison and to trial, 5 of them were executed, including the well-known educator and anarchist Francesc Ferrer Guàrdia, whose execution sparked outrage internationally and protests.
It did. And this conflict was one of the first big ones in the 20th century in Barcelona and in Catalonia as a whole.
Yeah, the tragic week's been a bit overshadowed by the Civil War and many other revolutions. But it's actually very important because it was the training ground for other revolutions, right? This was a failed revolution, but still it taught them how to organize themselves, how to build barricades, how to,
create a community around a revolutionary movement.
Exactly. It made them see that it was possible.
And at the beginning of the podcast, I mentioned Rose of Fire, which is the English translation of the Catalan name Rosa de Foc. And it's a nickname for Barcelona. But what does it mean? Where does it come from?
Well, there's no specific origin. It comes from the Tragic Week. We know that. But it's not attributed to someone in particular. It symbolizes the city's revolutionary spirit. Barcelona was and is a beautiful city, hence the rose, passion of the rose, the red. And it was the center of the workers' movement at the time, even in Europe as well. So we could say the fire from the revolution, from the barricades, the protests.
Rosa de Foc.
Rosa de Foc.
And Rosa de Foc wasn't the only nickname that Barcelona got. In fact, it was referenced by many writers, many thinkers, and also politicians as the city of big protests, right?
Yeah, we have the one you mentioned from Engels. The same words resonate in Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain.
Okay.
Then there's George Orwell's quote from 1936 during the Civil War. He said that when one came straight from England, the aspect of Barcelona was something startling and overwhelming. It was the first time that I'd ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle.
You can definitely understand here that he was talking about the initial stages of the Civil War when there was this euphoria that he described when he first came to the city.
And it's a beautiful way of looking at it. And then many more years later, a US President, George Bush, in 2003, supposedly responded to the massive anti-Iraq war demonstration in Barcelona, saying that the US national security policies cannot depend on the number of people taking to Barcelona street. And this was very funny as well.
Yeah, and then there's this other quote that kind of reflects the revolutionary spirit of Barcelona.
But by the other side, right? Not by the workers' side, but by the power. It's a quote from 1842. It's from a general, Spanish general, Baldomero Espartero, who said that to govern Spain properly, Barcelona should be bombed every 50 years. So
the revolutionary spirit of Barcelona just never dies.
Exactly, they need to kill it every 50 years.
And this quote was actually given to us by historian Salvador Lowe, who we talked to about why Barcelona has been and still is this revolutionary city. Let's hear what he said.
Barcelona is definitely one of the cities in the world that has seen some of the most urban fighting in history. Especially in the second half of the 19th century and the first third of the 20th, it was an epicenter of revolt, especially of the workers' revolts and the workers' movements.
I met with historian Salvador Lu at an emblematic site in Barcelona, the Tres Chimeneies Gardens in the neighborhood of Poble Sec, the site of La Canadenca strike, a general strike that began here in 1919 and forced the Spanish government to decree the 8-hour workday. Here Salvador gives me more insight into why Barcelona has always been such a revolutionary place.
Spain is one of the centres of industrialisation, and revolutionary syndicalism took strong root here, followed by anarcho-syndicalism, which are the most combative currents of the labour movement in Spain at the time.
Barcelona is not only inclined to be revolutionary ideologically, its geography also plays an important role.
We are a people in contact with other countries. We have a port and we have contact with other realities. The city also serves as a point of transit where people exiled from other parts of the world pass through, leaving behind their experiences and a culture that has led to various uprisings at different times.
Salvador also argues that Catalan nationalism is very closely related to Barcelona's revolutionary spirit.
Although the workers' movement is made up of people from very different backgrounds, it is true that since the middle of the 20th century, there was a convergence between the workers' cause and an increasingly popular national cause that was embraced by the working class, including those who had recently arrived from other parts of Spain. Supporting Catalan autonomy or even independence was often seen as a means of transformation or as a means of breaking with a regime that was in crisis.
Thanks to Salvador Lou for speaking with us. And as Salvador says, this revolutionary spirit of the Catalan capital, it hasn't died down. And the city has been and still is to this day the epicenter of many social and political protests and fights for justice, equality. And it's one of the reasons why I personally fell in love with the city.
Yeah, it was super easy, to be honest, to find big protests, big demonstrations in Barcelona and Catalonia. Speaking to Salvador, it was fun because he said they do historical tours. And he said it's the easiest city to do historical tours because you find history everywhere and mass demonstration, revolutions and protests.
What are some examples?
Well, where to begin?
Yeah.
Well, we have from the 1977 first LGBT March for Rights. The first one in all Spain took place in Barcelona. Then at the turn of the century, we have lots of protests, anti-war protests against the Iraq war in 2003, which gathered 1.3 million people. There's also some protests when terrorist attack happens, like the 2004 Madrid bombings. There was a huge protest as well. There's some big protests against ETA, the Basque nationalist terrorism group. And then, of course, the pro-independence movement, which has brought millions to the street year after year. From 2013, 14 and 15, the National Day, 11th of September, that every year was bringing 2 million people to the street.
And the 2019 ruling of independence leaders that sent them to jail also sparked huge protests all over the city.
And there was a lot of fire there. So
there was a lot of fire
That was maybe
there.
the last example of La Rosa de Foc, right?
I think I will agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember during the 2019 demonstrations going upstairs and seeing all these clouds of smoke.
And actually, I read some right-leaning newspapers comparing the Setmana Tràgica pictures of the skies of Barcelona full of smoke to the 2019 protests. So there's this image of both skies of Barcelona with fire. Of course, the Setmana Tràgica was bigger, but it tells you how important both were, right?
Yeah, I think the main difference is that no buildings were actually burned down.
Exactly.
They were only containers in 2019.
And nobody died.
And nobody died also. Yeah, so overall, there have been so many demonstrations. Actually, I've also heard people saying that Barcelona is the city where there are constantly protests every single week.
Yeah, we're very prone to protesting. We have lots of protests recently, lots of pro-Palestine protests against tourism, the famous one a few weeks ago, gentrification, housing. So yeah, it's a common thing.
So basically, there's no sign at all that the fire of the rose of Barcelona will be put out anytime soon, right?
No, absolutely not.
And with that, it's time for the Catalan phrase of the week. And it has something to do with fire too, right, Oriol?
Yeah, it does. Jugar amb foc.
Jugar amb foc. That is literally to play with fire.
Yeah, exactly. To take foolish risks, to act in a dangerous way. So yeah, don't do it.
Don't do it. That's a great piece of advice. And that's all we have time for today. Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe to Filling the Sink wherever you get your podcast if you haven't already. Thanks again to Josep Pich and Salvador Lou for speaking with us. Thanks to you, Oriol. And we'll be back again next week with another episode of Filling the Sink. On behalf of the team here at Catalan News, I'm Lea Beliaeva, wishing you a great weekend. Fins aviat. Adeu.